When it first came out, this was much faster and yet cheaper than a Porsche 993. Its 0 to 60 time was also the same as a Ferrari 512 TR, despite the fact that that cost 3 times as much as this. So on the surface then, it would appear that there are solid reasons why this Mk4 Supra is such a popular car. But does it really deserve its status, or was it just down to the fact that it's been featured in the Gran Turismo games and in the Fast and the Furious? Let's find out. Historically, in racing, Toyota Supra had received a sound thrashing from Nissan Skyline. So for the 4th generation, they got altogether more serious. This Supra was 95 kilos lighter than the Mark III, and they did that by having an alloy bonnet, alloy subframe, alloy top suspension arms, even hollow carpet fibers, and that rear spoiler is gas injected. So that means that rather than having a solid piece of plastic, when it's molded, they put little air gas bubbles in there. Obviously you have the same strength, but less plastic and less weight. It had double wishbones all round, Bilstein suspension, and even an electrically adjustable front spoiler. They developed a unique ABS system derived from Formula One, where each caliper was individually controlled depending on angle, speed and pitch of the car. It was so good that it held the record for braking from 70 miles an hour to 0 at 45 meters for the next 9 years. It was only when the Carrera GT came out that it managed to beat it by 1 meter. There were 2 basic versions of the Supra. Naturally aspirated with 220 horsepower, that was only sold in Japan and the USA. In Europe, we got the full fat turbo with 325 horsepower, and very unusually, the UK or European spec cars were much better than the JDM ones. So in the local market, they had different turbos, so that the power was limited to 280, but also the cars were much poorer in spec. Let me just read you a list of some of the extras that we got as standard over here. So it starts off with a larger intercooler, larger exhaust manifold, upgraded injectors, a bigger oil cooler, heated seats with leather, headlight washers, a differential cooler, active front spoiler, a bonnet scoop which directly feeds the turbo, bigger brakes, a thicker transmission shaft, traction control and wider wheels. One of the oddities about the A80 is that its popularity has very little to do with how good the standard car is. Rather, it's down to its tunability. The 3-litre straight-six was famous for being able to handle silly amounts of boost pressure. So it's not unknown for these to put out 800 horsepower quite easily and still be reliable within that. That in turn made it iconic within the Gran Turismo games, and of course then in the Fast and Furious films. In the UK, when it first came out, you were expected to part with £37,000 for one of these. Now, a Porsche 993 was 54,000, and this was definitely much quicker. But does it drive as well? And also, why is it that now these are worth roughly double what you would pay for a Nissan 300ZX or a Mitsubishi 3000 GT? Let's find out. Now, one of the downsides, I guess, to the UK market cars is that most of them came as autos. At least, though, the 4-speed here is one of the better units. Let's find out how it feels going down the road. Actually feels really good. I had to back off a little bit then. It's plenty quick. That gearbox is so smooth. The other thing is that in the car, although you do have a little bit of a muscular note to it, the engine feels just so muted. I thought this might be a torquey feeling car with its sequential twin turbo setup, but really it's quite a peaky engine. Yes, you don't have as much turbo lag as you might have in some of the other applications, but once the engine really comes on cam, which is around 4.5, well, not come on cam, when the second turbo comes in at 4.5, that's when it really comes to life properly. And that's when it's quite impressive, the pace that this has. Between 4.5 and 6.5, it really does fly. I mean, if you put your foot to the floor, the gearbox for a slushy auto is fairly responsive, but you're still kind of missing that ultimate last bit of control which you have with a manual. So to get this to respond, you just have to exaggerate with your throttle inputs, which disconnects a little bit with the rest of the car. Otherwise, it drives really well. I think the steering has got just the right weighing. It's not a particularly quick rack on this, but I think for a car dating back to the 90s, is pretty much par for the course. I think at that point in time, it was only the Alphas really that had very quick racks on them. Now, the interior room and the practicality isn't all it's cracked up to be. So at the back, those seats are pretty much just for show, and even with the driver's seat all the way back, although I am comfortable, there isn't exactly a surfeit of room. My legs aren't stretched out fully all the way. It's typical sort of 90s as well interior, which means I think really nice plastics, really well put together, but perhaps because it's just a sea of one colour, it's not the most dynamic looking in the world. The Japanese were having a bit of a renaissance at this point, I think. They were making some really interesting cars. But out of the quad, I would say, of sort of sports coupes that came out at that point, so that would be the RX-7, the Nissan 300ZX, and the 3000 GT. This, along with the RX-7, are the only ones that are sort of pushing more towards the sports car side. The RX-7 for sure. This is still considered a GT, but compared to the Nissan and the Mitsubishi, it does have a more sporting edge. It feels a little bit more agile on its feet, a little bit quicker to respond. It does drive well, but if you're comparing it like for like with a 993, the much more expensive 993, in terms of chassis dynamics, I think that's a little bit ahead. It's just a bit sharper, a bit more communicative, a little bit more evolved as a chassis. This really isn't bad. It is actually pretty good, but it's not quite sharp enough. But I think there's another two reasons why this has got such a big popularity behind it. One of it is the way it looks. I mean, that swoopy styling, that aggressive styling has aged pretty well, I think, overall, and just gives this car something that was also missing from some of its contemporaries. So the Nissan 300ZX, for example, I like that as a design, but it's a bit restrained in a way. It's almost classy compared to this. This is just so in your face. And the other thing is, I think it really didn't hurt that this was the last real Supra that we can say that was made. So there was a 5th gen, but it was a 17-year gap. So this was made up until 2002. Then nothing happened until 2019 when the last one came out. But the thing with that is, as we all know, it's really just a re-engineered BMW Z4. You can't say it was a true successor to this. Now, it may be a legendary car now, but when it was actually being produced, it wasn't that popular in all its markets. So in the UK, for example, they stopped selling it in 1996. Carried on being made for another 6 years. But here, they said that they'd stopped selling it because of emissions regulations. I don't think that's true. It just wasn't selling well enough for them to continue marketing it in our country. Now, if you want to buy yourself a Supra, then there is a problem, and that is that they're so sought after that they're worth a lot of money. So I had a look last night, and it seems to be between £30,000 and £60,000. Being an automatic, this would be valued slightly, well, its value would be slightly reduced, because in every other way, it's got 91,000 miles, it's in super great condition. So I think if it was a manual, it might be a £60,000 car. As it is as an auto, it does knock a lot of the value down. They're not easy to convert back, they're very expensive. Just in parts alone, it'd be about £10,000. Once you have bought one though, the good news is that they're not that expensive to maintain. The engines, as long as you do relatively consistent oil changes, are good for up to about 200,000 miles. Whilst you have it, the main thing will be that you want to do the belt change every 50,000 miles. You should budget between 1,000 and 2,000 for that, and all the extra bits that will come up with it. But otherwise, it's not too thirsty. They're well built. Rust doesn't affect them too badly. And they do have the famous Toyota reliability and build quality. Now, Paul, who brought this down to me today, has a really varied collection of cars. This one I think he very much considers as the jewel in the crown. But go and have a look on his Instagram to see the wildly different cars that he owns. Now, I think most people would agree that the Mk4 is the daddy when it comes to Supras, but in my mind, it was actually the Mk2 that was the first proper Supra that came out. If you want to find out more about that car, I did a video a couple of months ago, and there's the whole story available for you to click on here. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to Paul for bringing it down. Look forward to seeing you for the next video.